A day before Christmas, what should have been a festive season ended with a mysterious tragedy that shocked the whole world when Flight TR571 vanished in the Arctic. That afternoon, people around the world were busy preparing for Christmas Day, with last-minute shopping for gifts and even Christmas trees, planning and cooking meals, and preparing for families, friends, and relatives who are coming over for special gatherings. On the other hand, the people inside the plane have no idea that it will be the last flight that they will take. However, when the plane was found 30 years after, what they saw inside made the whole incident even more enigmatic. It turned out that they were not alone, and what they found can potentially challenge our foundational knowledge about nature and how it works. The plane, as well as its 200 passengers and members of the crew, wasn't able to survive the violent Arctic storm that it had to go through. This plane is just as big as the Boeing 777 series planes, the Comac C919 plane, and the Airbus A320 family planes. Despite the weather conditions, no one expected that such horrific incident will happen to the plane, as this model is popular for its reliability in the field of commercial aviation. It was traveling from Anchorage to its destination, Reykjavik, which is the capital city of Iceland. It is known as one of the safest, cleanest, and greenest cities in the world. That's why it's a popular destination among tourists from different parts of the world. Some of the passengers were returning home. Some were looking forward to spending the holidays there. Some were coming for work or business, but none of them was able to make it. Despite the expected passing of one of the fiercest storms of the decade, TR571 was allowed to fly to Iceland. The plane had to endure icy blasts and ruthless snow. The last communication received from the plane's captain, Richard Caldwell, came in at 11:30 p.m. Air traffic control noticed how different Captain Caldwell sounded. His voice usually showed confidence, and he had always spoke in a relaxed manner. This time, it's different. There was a sense of urgency and tension as the captain notified them that they were experiencing extreme turbulence and that 2 engines of the plane are down. In addition, he notified them that the plane is in dangerously low altitude. The controllers tried to respond, but their messages can't get through. The other line went dead. No matter how many times they call on TR571 to respond, they didn't get anything. There were visuals in the radar, but it didn't do anything to reassure the controllers about the plane's safety, as they can see it swinging sharply, like a life blown by the fierce winds from one direction to another. By 11:17 p.m., the visual stopped, and the plane just virtually disappeared. From a bleeping dot, the air traffic control had lost Flight TR571, the captain, the crew, and all 200 passengers of the plane. All of them seemed to be engulfed by the merciless Arctic ice. Some of the other tragic plane crashes that happened in the Arctic included the plane crash that took 10 lives in Alaska in 2025, the plane crash in the Swiss Alps, which happened in 1968, and a B-17 warplane that was discovered in 2014. It is said that the warplane crashed in the Arctic decades ago. What made it more tragic is that those who survived this plane crash were eaten by polar bears based on the evidence found around the crash site. No signs of polar bears were seen around the crash site of Flight TR571, but what actually happened was even stranger. Just as this Arctic storm was one of the fiercest and strongest that the area experienced on that decade, Flight TR571 also brought about the biggest search operations in the history. On Christmas Day, the day after the plane disappeared with everyone in it, rescue teams searched along the plane's flight path. The best tools and equipment were used, including 4 icebreakers, multiple helicopters, and 8 planes specially designed for search and rescue in Arctic terrain. The possible areas where the plane may have landed were thoroughly searched, especially the frozen sea. The frozen sea is quite a dangerous spot to crash in, as it's the whole Arctic Sea, and its ice can be so thick as affected by the air temperature, the water temperature, how old the existing ice is, and the amount and intensity of sunlight reflecting on the surface of the water. Therefore, all the top-of-the-line equipment and professional rescuers are needed. Even divers were deployed, and some volunteered to endure the piercing icy water to look for any trace or clue of what happened to Flight TR571 and its passengers. However, defying all logic, the plane seemed to have completely disappeared in thin air, or thick ice for that matter. There wasn't any kind of signal detected by the radar whatsoever. There wasn't any debris that may have been left out by the plane if ever it had crashed. There wasn't any attempt of emergency broadcast or just sending any message out at all. There are also other airplanes that vanished in the history of aviation, including the Urnin or the Eagle, which was attempting to fly to the North Pole and crashed in the Arctic Ocean in 1897. The Bolkovitinoff DBA, flying from Moscow to Alaska, attempting to go there through the North Pole, which also crashed in the Arctic Ocean in 1937, and the consolidated PBY-5A Catalina, which vanished while carrying a whole football team coming from Kodiak to its destination, which was the Dutch harbor, and crashed in Alaska in 1947. Days passed, but the rescuers didn't find anything. Soon, the days turned into weeks, and the Arctic didn't seem to care at all. It went about with its routine, with one snowstorm after another, either erasing or covering up what could have been traces of the missing plane, if there were ever any. Rescuers were also having a hard time staying on the ground for extended periods of time because of the cold. Gradually, the hope of finding and rescuing the people inside the missing plane dwindled down. Still, rescuers continued with the task at hand and gave it their best. 1 month passed and the search and rescue mission was called off. It seems pointless because even if there were survivors, it would be impossible for them to survive that long by themselves in the Arctic. The case was named the Bermuda Ice Triangle as the plane was officially declared lost. This incident left the experts flabbergasted. There wasn't any logic behind a gigantic plane just vanishing without the smallest trace. It was as if it never really existed in the first place. The most popular theory was that upon impact, the storm destroyed the plane completely. Others believed that the plane sank into the frozen sea as the Arctic snowstorms continue to bury it even deeper. There were also other planes buried in the Arctic Ocean, so it was also possible. These planes include the P-38, which was also known as the Lost Squadron, which landed on ice in 1942, and the AN-12, which crashed in the Arctic Ocean in 1973, and remained there until now. However, if ever the plane did crash, it was supposed to send out emergency signals, but there was nothing, just complete silence. It seems like Flight TR571 had become yet another buried mystery of the Arctic. Almost 4 decades after the incidents, the silence was broken. On January 2024, exactly 37 years after the mysterious disappearance of the plane, Jonathan Whitmore, a globally renowned Arctic climate change expert, accidentally discovered what would be a breakthrough in the Flight TR571 conundrum. He was observing satellite images when he spotted a metallic reflection in a giant sea of white ice. The military satellite transmitting the image shows a shape and size that was highly unusual in the area. It was definitely not a natural formation. Although initially they didn't have any idea about what that was, all they know is that it wasn't supposed to be there, whatever it was. They were alarmed and curious at the same time. They couldn't wait to observe it closer and be able to identify what exactly that object was. Whitmore thought that it might be some ship used to survey the Arctic, or perhaps parts of some military equipment. However, a young radar expert named Amanda believed otherwise. She came with numerous thermal images, and when they figured it out, they were deeply saddened. It revealed patterns of repeated footprints over time. Estimated, the image of the giant metal perfectly matches Flight TR571's dimensions. Because of this discovery, they got even more excited. They can't wait to see it up close. Finally, when they least expect it, they have found the missing plane. News traveled fast, and soon enough, professionals in the field of science and different government agencies have heard about the accidental discovery of TR571. After a few days, the largest expedition team went to the Arctic with heavy-duty helicopters and a composition of dozens of rescuers, and other experts went on a highly dangerous mission to find and gather the remains of TR-571. They were also working against time because of the spring thaw that loomed above them. The rising temperature on each day that passed didn't help at all. The ice becomes more and more unstable. Little did the team know that the Arctic has yet another surprise for them. They were just about to discover that the plane wasn't alone, and what they have known about nature their whole life was just about to change. Although they were primarily sent on a mission to find and get back whatever remains of the missing plane, they were met with even stranger things. One of the team members, an animal behaviorist named Elizabeth Harper, was standing by the excavation site when something even colder than Arctic winds washed over her when she noticed the eerie silence. She had seen numerous situations in similarly harsh climate. However, something felt eerie at that moment. The Arctic was never completely silent. You would always hear what seemed to be groans of the ice with its movements, the strong winds leaving its marks on the snowdrifts, the ground breaking at some point from time to time, but not in the excavation site. She shared her observation that something is different with the fauna in the area in an almost inaudible voice. Then, the team started noticing subtle signs and disturbances in the area, tracks covered by moving frost that they first thought of as belonging to wolves or bears. Elizabeth, as an expert in the field, noticed what others didn't and brushed the frost away to see what was underneath it. With the crust of snow gone, the grounds revealed round, padded, clawed prints that seemed to belong to some kind of a big cat. However, big cats don't usually stay and live in the Arctic. The closest possibility was that the prints belonged to a lynx. Still, it has never happened before, and when she pressed her hand against the mark, it was so much bigger that it couldn't have belonged to a lynx. Elizabeth murmured her disbelief as she got a dreadful feeling at the pit of her stomach. With this, the wind blew, dusting the team with some snow, and for a moment she felt something foreboding watching her. The storm broke, and suddenly the sky filled with the softest pink and blue, the famous northern lights. It was a breathtaking sight as the sky seemed to shimmer. However, something else caught their eyes, something in contrast with the beauty and the warm feeling that the northern lights bring. Their attention shifted to the three figures on top of a ridge, unmoving, and seemed to watch their every move. Elizabeth's mouth felt dry as her throat tightened. The figures seemed to glimmer against the white terrain and the ethereal pastels of the sky. However, what they brought wasn't warmth and pleasure, but terror. Three silvery white giant lynxes watched them. The lynxes blended with the snow seamlessly. Without the aurora borealis, they might have been chameleons, invisible to the naked eye. Turned out that the figures belonged to a mother and cubs. However, the cubs weren't really cubs anymore, as they looked like they were almost full-grown. They didn't warn the team whatsoever. They didn't jump and ran after the team. They didn't snarl or made any noise. They didn't lower their ears as well. All they did was just stand on the ridge. With their golden eyes fixed on the team, it became clear that the team wasn't studying them anymore, but it was the other way around. The giant lynxes were studying them. When more team members noticed the giant lynxes, they fell silent. They avoided movement and talked to each other with hushed voice. When a team member attempted to grab a camera and document the moment, the mother lynx tilted her head ever so slightly. A team member commented that the lynxes weren't supposed to be there. Slowly, the team continued working while the lynxes continued watching them. Since that day, the lynxes showed up on the same spot at the same time each morning. The team, though, that maybe they just wanted to observe, and that the giant lynxes were just curious about who they are and what they are doing there. However, it became apparent later on that they were actually patrolling. Their movements were calculated, and their eyes never leaving the humans. They also have specific spots where they would stop for a while. The team would hear the sound of claws scratching ice and paws pressing on snow. Elizabeth, though, that it was like the giant lynxes were actually marking the ground. She even though that maybe they were trying to communicate. Maybe they were trying to tell them something. One night, the team was gathering their things, preparing to retire to their respective tents. Suddenly, there was a forceful wind that blew through the camp, knocking the heavy generator down. As it was about to fall directly on Elizabeth, a silver shadow came out of nowhere. Against the moon, it looked magical, a figure moving so swiftly, gleaming like a gem. It turned out to be the mother lynx, ramming into Elizabeth and causing her to be thrown away from where the generator landed. When the generator fell onto the ground, a loud crash filled the frozen air, and if that landed on Elizabeth, the results would have been devastating. Everybody was speechless, unable to move. It took them a few seconds to process what had just happened. Elizabeth's heart was crazily pounding against her chest. It felt like her ribs were about to shatter. As she turned her head ever so slowly, she found herself gazing into the eyes of the giant mother lynx who was standing right beside her. She can hear her pulse that she paid no attention to the howl of the wind. What she saw on the eyes of the mother lynx was knowledge and purpose. It was her intention to save Elizabeth. The realization made each of the team members shiver. The chills didn't come from the cold, though. Instead, it came from knowing that the lynxes weren't just watching them out of curiosity. They were actually there to warn them about something. Still, the show must go on, and they continued digging, keen on accomplishing their mission. Fighting against time, they used the best available technology to melt the remaining eyes and to pump the melted ice out of the excavation area. On the 8th day, they got their first evidence of the story that TR571 has to tell. The removed snow revealed the dusty and faded logo right on the fuselage of the plane. It became official. TR571 was found after 37 long years after it was declared lost. However, Emily found some irregularities about the ice that surrounded the plane. It has the signs and markings of decades' worth of walking, trampling, and pressing. It appeared that something has been walking around it repeatedly and consistently as if to guard it. Then the lynxes reappeared. They went to watch the excavation more closely, moving swiftly, almost impossible to notice. As the researchers went further down the excavation, the lynxes started scratching specific spots on the ground. The team thought that the giant lynxes were warning them about something. They just don't know what they were warning them about. There were things scattered inside the plane, particularly on the frozen seats like unused coffee cups. When the team checked the seats, they found something in one of the first-class seats was the diary of one of the stewardesses of TR571 named Laura Bennett. It was covered with newspaper to ensure that it would survive the cold. It was a diary, yet it seemed to be a horror novel with scenes that no one would wish to see. Entries started on December 25, 1988, the next day after the plane crashed. It turned out that out of all the 200 passengers, only 28 survived. Captain Henderson took on the responsibility of food distribution and shift schedules. Laura wrote about creatures outside the plane watching them. Although she wasn't sure what these creatures were, they knew that they weren't wolves. On December 28, 1988, the temperature became warmer, minus 52 degrees Celsius to be exact, according to Laura. Sadly, 4 out of the 28 plane crash survivors didn't survive that night. They all pressed closer to each other and huddled to keep one another warm. Then they were surprised to find 2 fresh hairs at the plane's entrance. It was as if someone intentionally placed them there, knowing that they need them. On the 30th of December, Laura wrote on her diary again. She shared that the lynxes would walk around them every night. They would look at them with their shiny eyes. However, they don't feel unsafe with the lynxes anymore. They know that the lynxes don't mean them any harm. While they initially thought that these creatures were hunting them, they realized that they were actually protecting them. By January 2, 1989, only 12 of them were left. One by one, the survivors succumbed to hypothermia. However, the lynxes stayed with them. On that day, the mother lynx brought Laura food. In the evening, she saw the mother lynx sitting close to Maria to keep her warm before Maria died. Lynxes have thick fur, so aside from keeping their own bodies warm, they can also help others stay warm. According to the National Weather Service, there was heavy snowfall in the area from January 6 to January 8, 1988. Surely, this further aggravated the situation. On January 10, 1989, Laura was the last woman standing. Still, the lynxes stayed with her. They taught her how to move in the darkness and guided her to the paths that are safe to walk on. She wrote that she wasn't cold anymore and that she wasn't afraid anymore. The last page was uncharacteristically worn, and even Laura's handwriting had become shaky. One sentence remained clear, as if screaming and making sure that it got the reader's attention. It said that no one should die alone in the white silence. After listening to the last journal entry as it was read aloud, the whole team fell silent. If they haven't seen the lynxes firsthand, anyone who read Laura's diary would think that she was hallucinating. However, it amazed them that the lynxes have seen it all happen. They have actually been there with the survivors right from the very beginning, and they were still there. Considering that lynx are known as predatory cats, the way that they protected the plane crash survivors was truly amazing. They are also solitary creatures, so it makes people wonder what made them decide to go near the survivors, as they actually don't like interactions with others. The most mind-boggling thing about the whole thing was that they remembered. TR571 was never truly alone. The survivors didn't all die in the white silence. Amidst the solid ice grounds, the piercing icy wind, and the endless white snow, there were hearts beating with empathy and compassion that didn't discriminate. To them, the species didn't matter. In retrospect, this was the opposite of what one would expect as humans usually hunt lynxes for their fur. Even to this day, teams who went on Arctic expeditions still report about giant lynx sightings. And to this day, people who read or heard about this story are left astounded with what the lynxes did.